We are in the final stretch of the FIDE Women's Candidates 2026, and round 12 is absolutely electric. Two players are tied at the top with 7 points each, and every half point now carries enormous weight. The race to become the challenger for the Women's World Championship title could not be tighter. Heading into this round, Vaishali and Zhu Jiner share the lead, with Anna Muzichuk and Sara Asobieva just half a point behind. 3 decisive results are on the board today, meaning the standings are about to shift dramatically. Vaishali Rameshbabu, the dynamic Indian Grandmaster known for her aggressive, attacking chess and fearless preparation, faces Zhu Jiner, the Chinese Grandmaster with a higher rating and a reputation for deep positional understanding and precise in-game technique. Both players enter this game level on points at 7 each, meaning this is essentially a direct title eliminator. A win for either player could be decisive in the race to become the challenger. The Caro-Can defense. Advanced variation is one of the most respected defenses at the top level. Black challenges the white center immediately with a solid pawn structure, aiming for counterplay on the queen side. Players like Magnus Carlsen and Anatoly Karpov have championed it for decades. The resulting positions often feature a closed center with slow maneuvering on both flanks, though white's space advantage can be dangerous if converted well. White stakes a claim in the center with the king's pawn, immediately grabbing space and opening lines for the bishops and queen, and black responds with the Caro-Can, one of the most solid replies to e4. The idea is to support a future d5 push with the c-pawn rather than burning a tempo with a vulnerable d-pawn alone. White reinforces the center with the d-pawn, establishing the classic e4 and d4 duo and inviting black to stake out territory in the middle of the board. Black immediately challenges the center, the defining move of the Caro-Can. Now white must decide how to handle the central tension. The advance variation. White pushes forward and claims a space advantage in the center, choosing a patient positional fight over an immediate exchange. This variation demands that black find active counterplay or risk being squeezed. Black develops the light-squared bishop outside the pawn chain before closing the position, a key idea in the advanced Caro-Can. The bishop is now active and will not be locked behind pawns. White places the bishop on d3 to challenge black's active bishop on f5, a common and direct approach. The bishop eyes both the f5 bishop and the king side. Black trades off the bishop, eliminating a potential attacker. This gives white the double d-pawns but also opens the c-file for potential queenside activity. White recaptures toward the center, accepting the double d-pawns. The structure is unusual, but white keeps a solid pawn chain and the d3 pawn actually supports future play. Black solidifies the center and prepares to develop the kingside pieces. The position is beginning to take on the character of a closed French-like structure. White develops the knight toward the center, adding pressure to d5 and preparing to continue building the position. Black develops the knight to e7 rather than the more common f6, keeping the f-file clear and planning to reroute the knight to more active squares such as g6 or f5. White brings the second knight out, completing basic development on the kingside and preparing to castle. Black plays a prophylactic move, preventing any bishop or knight from jumping to g5 and restricting white's minor piece activity on the kingside. White launches a kingside space grab, advancing the h-pawn to restrict black's pieces and create potential for a future attacking push. Black repositions the knight to d7, reinforcing the center and preparing to develop the queenside. The knight is headed for more active outposts. White retreats the knight to e2, planning to reroute it to a more active square. This also prepares to support a future g4 push or to reposition via f4. Black prepares queenside counterplay, supporting a future c5 break. This is a thematic idea in these Caro-Can advanced positions. White develops the bishop quietly to d2, connecting the rooks and preparing to castle queenside or regroup pieces. Black fires the thematic queenside break, striking at white's pawn center and opening lines for the queenside pieces. White activates the rook along the c-file, placing pressure on the newly opened c-file and preparing to respond to black's queenside expansion. Black brings the knight to c6, increasing central control and putting pressure on the d4 pawn. White advances the h-pawn aggressively, trying to fix black's kingside structure and create a long-term weakness on h6. However, this committal push may leave white's position slightly overextended. And the engine now begins to favor black. Black maneuvers the queen to c8, connecting the rooks and preparing to swing the queen to the b-file or a6 to create queenside pressure. White captures on c5, opening up the d file and trying to generate activity. However, the engine notes this as a mistake, as it relieves the central tension in a way that benefits black's piece activity. The evaluation swings close to half a pawn in black's favor. Black recaptures with the b-pawn, and now notice how black's pawn on c5 is well supported, while white's structure on the queen side has some holes. White activates the queen to a4. Eyeing the c6 knight and trying to create queenside pressure to compensate for the positional concessions. Black counters by posting the queen on b7, covering key squares and stepping out of the pin on c6 while keeping the queenside under observation. White finally castles kingside, getting the king to safety after a prolonged opening phase. Black activates the rook to b8, placing it on the half-open b file and increasing queenside pressure. White doubles rook potential by moving the rook to c2, preparing to support the c file and connect the rooks. Black supports the queenside pawn structure and prepares further expansion with a future b5, though the pawn is still on b8. White centralizes the queen to f4, eyeing the kingside and keeping options open for an attack. Black swings the queen to b5, a very active square where it eyes both the a4 square and the e2 knight. The queen is now well placed to support queenside operations. White retreats the knight to c1, looking to reroute it to a better square. This is a somewhat passive decision that reflects the difficulty of white's position. Black activates the rook to g8. Preparing to support a kingside pawn advance. The position is becoming very dynamic, and the engine evaluates black as better here by close to a full pawn. White tries to undermine black's queenside with a b3 push, aiming to generate some counterplay. Black launches the kingside pawn storm, pushing g5 to open lines and create attacking chances. White captures en passant, opening the g file. This keeps the position complicated. Black recaptures with the rook, placing it aggressively on the g6 square where it eyes the g file and supports kingside operations. White advances the d-pawn, trying to create central counterplay and open lines in the middle of the board. Black develops the bishop to e7, completing the development of the kingside and preparing to castle or keep the king in the center safely. White develops the bishop to e3, supporting the d4 pawn and trying to coordinate the pieces. Black strikes with c4, a powerful pawn advance that attacks the d3 pawn and tries to fix white's pawn weaknesses. The engine shows this push swings the evaluation significantly in black's favor. White captures on c4, opening the b file but also creating a passed pawn situation that will become very important. Black recaptures with the d-pawn, and now the c4 pawn is a dangerous passed pawn supported by black's pieces. White repositions the knight to e2, trying to challenge the c4 pawn and improve coordination. Black plants the knight on b4. A fantastic outpost where it cannot be easily driven away and where it eyes d3 and c2. White moves the rook to b2, but this loses significant ground. The engine shows the evaluation swings to nearly -1 for white, as the rook is somewhat passive here and black's pieces are becoming overwhelming. Black centralizes the queen to c6, a powerful move that targets the e5 pawn and keeps all of black's pieces working in harmony. White doubles rooks on the b file, but this is another inaccuracy. The engine now pushes the evaluation to over -1 pawn for white. Black's knight on b4, passed pawn on c4, and centralized queen create too much pressure for white to handle. Black retreats the rook to b5, and while this is marked as a mistake by the engine, it still maintains black's advantage. The rook steps away from the b file where white has just doubled rooks, which was the most logical response. The position remains very difficult for white. White pushes d5, a desperate lunge to create counterplay and open lines in the center before black consolidates. Black captures on d5 with the knight, accepting the pawn. However, this is flagged as a mistake. The knight on b4 was so powerful that moving it away gives white some tactical chances. The evaluation remains clearly in black's favor, but the margin narrows slightly. White centralizes the queen to e4, immediately threatening the rook on b5 and the knight on d5, creating some tactical pressure. Black retreats the queen to b7, but this is another inaccuracy. According to the engine, the evaluation is still comfortably in black's favor, but more precise continuations were available. Black needed to keep up the pressure rather than stepping back. White posts the bishop on d4, a strong centralized square where it controls several key diagonals. Black advances h5, but the engine identifies this as a significant mistake. The pawn push advances into territory where it can become a target, and white is given temporary breathing room. A more accurate move would have kept the advantage more safely. White steps the king to h1, getting off the g1 square and out of potential back rank issues. Black swings the rook to g4, attacking the queen and creating threats along the fourth rank. The rook is now very active. White moves the queen to h7, checking the king and stepping away from the attacked square while keeping pressure on the king side. Black advances the h-pawn to h4, pushing it further down the board. The engine marks this as a mistake, as the pawn rush creates some complications that could have been avoided with more precise play. White repositions the queen to h5, maintaining pressure and eyeing the rook on g4 and various kingside squares. Black moves the rook to g6, retreating slightly but maintaining the pin and pressure on the g-file. The engine notes this as another inaccuracy, though black remains well ahead. White checks with the queen on h8, forcing a response from black. Black blocks with the knight on f8, covering the check. However, this is flagged as a significant mistake. The engine shows the advantage swinging considerably. Blocking with the knight blocks the king's escape, and the rook on g6 becomes miscoordinated. This is the moment where the game truly turns dangerous for black. White advances the a-pawn, trying to create queenside counterplay and open lines against black's king. Black activates the rook to b3, a provocative move that targets white's pieces, though the engine again identifies this as slightly inaccurate. White captures the rook on b3, trading material. Black recaptures with the c-pawn, and now the passed b-pawn on b3 becomes a major factor. This pawn is only 2 squares from promotion and will cost white dearly. White attempts to blockade the b-pawn with the knight, but this is a serious mistake. The engine evaluation swings dramatically to over -2 for white. The knight on c1 is poorly placed and cannot effectively stop the b3 pawn while also keeping up with black's threats elsewhere. Black advances the h-pawn to h3, a powerful move that creates a second passed pawn and tears apart white's kingside. Now the evaluation swings by over 6 pawns according to the engine. This is the moment the game is effectively decided. White captures the b-pawn with the knight, taking the passed pawn but allowing the h-pawn to become unstoppable. The engine shows the evaluation crashing to over -5. White is losing a full piece or allowing promotion. Black captures on g2 with check, and the evaluation swings by over 11 pawns. The h-pawn has now crashed through and promotes to a queen with check. White's position is completely lost. White steps the king to h2, the only square available, but there is no escape from what follows. Black promotes the pawn to a queen with check. A new queen appears on the board and the evaluation swings again by over 11 pawns. Despite being the obvious move, the engine notes this as slightly imprecise compared to other promotion options, but black is still completely winning. White captures the new queen with the knight, the only recapture available. Black brings the knight to c3, forking the rook on b1 and threatening further material gains. The engine evaluation is over -5 for white, and the position is completely hopeless. White resigned after this move. This game was decided by Zhu Jiner's relentless queenside pressure and a devastating passed pawn. The b3 and h3 passed pawns working in tandem proved too much for white to handle. Once the h-pawn crashed through to promote, the game was over. A crucial win for Zhu in the direct battle at the top of the standings. What a round in the FIDE women's candidates. The battle at the top is as fierce as it gets, and today's results will reshape the standings dramatically heading into the final rounds. The race to become the Women's World Championship challenger is far from over. Let us know in the comments who you think will win the tournament, and if you enjoyed this analysis, please subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an update.